Hey everyone, this is Space Cafe Podcast, and I am Marcus. Welcome to a brand new edition of Space Cafe Podcast. In a new year, in a new age, at least as far as the American presidency is concerned. I've really taken this show into my heart. Last year, when SpaceWatch.Global CEO Torsten Kriening asked me to do a podcast, I was a little hesitant, I must say. Although I have professional radio experience, it was then a step into the unknown. Today, it's almost a year since our first steps, and I'm looking forward to every single production that lies ahead of us. And I tell you why. Because I'm also the biggest fan of this show. Because I'm fascinated by the stories our interviewees are willing to share with us. And because they help us better understand this fascinating renaissance of space travel. History is being made here, and we want to listen with you to the pulse of this so fascinating episode of humanity. So, thank you for your interest and loyalty out there. As for our episode today, I met our interviewee at CERN at a pretty cool workshop, the Particle Physics Center in Geneva, Switzerland. This workshop tried to bring new, unusual thoughts into the world of physics off the beaten path. And so the organizers invited a motley crew of creatives, artists, and authors, along with physicists, that is. One of the initiators is the British science fiction author Una McCormack. She's known for her contributions to Star Trek and Doctor Who. I immediately knew that I would want Una for our Space Cafe podcast. It's not unusual for science fiction authors to have a major influence on science fact. So I called her, and she graciously allowed me to press the record button.
My absolute pleasure. I'm not out partying on any given night, so I didn't do that before, but so it's a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy my conversation with Una McCormack, a wonderful, fascinating personality. So, Una, let's talk about your world, the world of imagination, that is. And in how far do you think has science fiction influenced the way we think about space travel today?
Oh, that's such a huge question. How tricky. I'd possibly have to go back to this idea of poetic technologies again, that it gives us a glimpse of a spectacle that moves us. So the reason I love science fiction is very simple, and that's that round about my 6th birthday, I got taken to see Star Wars in the cinema. And I sat there and I saw this vast expanse of space, and then a massive spaceship flew through it. And that was, something was triggered then that communicated to me vastness, limitlessness, potential, possibility. And these are very simple things, I think, ideas to put into a kid's mind. I mean, what comes next is obviously just a lark and adventure, probably closer to fantasy than science fiction. But what it gave was the spectacle.
Right.
And what it gave was this idea that science fiction writers talk a lot about, is this idea of a sense of wonder, that something fills you with awe, not something numinous, but something about the material world and its hugeness, its capacity. It's something that you have to struggle to understand, but that is perhaps comprehensible, partly by ourselves, but partly in that vast endeavour that we call science. So that's what science fiction does for me, I think. Whether it shapes science or whether it shapes scientific progress, I don't know. There's a lot of science fiction, it just misses it by miles, that it's, hilarious to go back and look at 50s sci-fi and see how badly it misses the mark. Particularly in kind of social relations, I think science fiction is very poor. You go back and read 50s science fiction, you go, the flying car is lovely, but Did we have to have this nuclear family? You know, this kind of thing. Completely misses this sort of thing. But I think in stimulating this need, I think it's incredible.
Perhaps it's the wrong question in the first place to ask as to if science fiction helps trigger factual science, because what science fiction does is open a mind space and inspire thinking. So perhaps it's the wrong question to ask. Science fiction helps open one's mind. Isn't that what you're saying?
I think,
in a nutshell,
I'd something a little bit more specific than that, because I think certainly for me, all literature will do that. That reading Middlemarch or reading Dickens or reading Tolstoy opens my mind. It opens my empathic ability, or it helps me capture an image or understand something about the condition of being human and living in the world. But what science fiction does is partly that. It's often less good on character or empathy. That's not necessarily the point. But it does this thing of opening an idea space, of perhaps helping you think beyond the immediate, helping you think in vaster terms, in terms of time. I mean, obviously, you could get this through studying physics, but some of us are not quite equipped to do that and have to get our ideas in a slightly more palatable form. And fiction does that. I think when it's good, it opens your mind to the other, but centers you as you're centered as human, because you're a human being reading it. So it's your human experience of the vastness of space and time and the universe, I think.
Is it a misconception on my side that science fiction is very often connected to space and to the outside? Because science fiction could also turn inward and look on the inside. So why do we usually connect science fiction to the outside?
I suppose science fiction plays itself out in many different kinds of narrative form. And often what you're going to get is you might get philosophical. It does have a philosophical mode, which kind of comes from its utopian past, perhaps. You might see this in writers like, David Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus, or you would see social thought experiments in utopian literature, or Olaf Stapledon's work, which is philosophical and a little bit more meditative. Even someone like, I hesitate to say because reputation is quite bad now, somebody like Lovecraft is trying to sense something of the numinous. Where science fiction, I think, gets entangled with space is that it moves from being a literature of it has its roots in Europe's encounter with what Europe called the New World. So this sense that we had literally landed on a different world. And these kinds of narratives get entangled with technological innovation and start to become things like Jules Verne's stories or H.G. Wells' stories. So this sort of sense of technological adventure. These are adventure stories. They're caught up in thrillers. They're suspenseful. They're exciting. And that partly is why I think science fiction lends itself to these sort of spacefaring adventures. When it's good, of course, it's a little bit more meditative, a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more careful. And that's where you see people like Le Guin taking the kind of standard stories of science fiction and making them something more universal, more intelligent, more tooled, I think.
Is history repeating itself, just extending its radius, its horizon? Because you just mentioned the discovery and the conquest of the new world, so to say, and now we're just doing the same thing again with different technological capabilities.
I think if you were going to take a sort of large-scale view of the genre, you might say that a lot of what science fiction has done has been to, first of all, justify colonialism and then to apologize for it, I think. I'm talking about Western Anglophone here, which is what I know. It'd be very different if you were reading Afrofuturism or so forth, which would be speaking from the experience of being conquered and enslaved. But the kind of Anglophone stuff that I know best is, I think, coming to terms, first of all, justifying, as I say, science fiction has this justificatory mode, and then later coming to terms with what has been done. And I think what science fiction is very good at doing is having an abstract mode where you don't need to necessarily get into the specificities of a particular place or time, but you can abstract from that to maybe draw general lessons or general ideas about, I don't know, invasion, colonialism, change, conservation, environmental decay, all these sorts of things. It gives you an abstract space in which to play out these grand human dramas, I think.
I started with a difficult question. Let me add an even more difficult now. Do you have a favorite piece of science fiction? The mother of science fiction, that is.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, a very easy question for me to answer, actually. It's The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. I think Le Guin is easily the best writer of science fiction in the English language, at least. Absolutely towering as far as I'm concerned. It's a travesty she can get the Nobel Prize and all these sorts of things. You're a genuinely visionary writer, and a writer who knew her genre, and a literary writer, somebody who had been trained in romance literature, was an intellectual, very intelligent, had a background in anthropology as well. She knew exactly what she was doing. And The Dispossessed is an anarchist utopia and a critique of capitalism. And it is the most perfectly crafted and beautifully done book, the kind of book that you open and you go, this is what science fiction should be doing. It's quite dated in many ways now. It's from 1974. It's certain aspects of it are a little bit dated, particularly perhaps the gender relations. And then other times you just open it and you go, wow, that's not changed. I just deeply recommend it. I think if you asked anyone who is the best technically writer of science fiction in English, I think everyone would go Le Guin. Her reputation has just grown and grown since her death. There are two novels, I think, that people pick one or the other. It's The Dispossessed or Left Hand of Darkness, which is her book that looks at gender. And that is often, I think, the most pivotal book for people, but I pick The Dispossessed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Una, your name is associated with some of the most outstanding pieces of science fiction, primarily Star Trek and Doctor Who. So let's talk about Star Trek. How does one become part of that elusive panel of writers?
That was very, very by accident, in fact. And,
of course.
It's very, yeah, that's all these things are. I was doing a PhD in something completely different. And it's nice to hear that people say nice things about Star Trek, because there were some really good people who wrote, people like James Blish or Joe Haldeman and Vonda McIntyre. So some really good people have written these books. And then me. What I was doing it was very simple. I was watching a show called Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I was supposed to be doing a master's degree in psychology. Mostly I was on the internet reading fan fiction. So then I started trying my hand at it and posting it online. And then I got an email from the guy who was editing the Star Trek books, pocket books at Simon & Schuster at the time, saying my stuff had been recommended. Would I like to pitch? And that was my into the range. So it really was, they came and asked me. I was going to be doing something different entirely. Wow. And then I just found that I really enjoyed doing it. I liked doing it. I realised my PhD was in sociology, particularly looking at how bureaucracies do and don't function. And I realised that everything that I was interested in writing and talking about, I could do in a science fiction novel. And people would read it. So, which they were unlikely to do with anything that was going to come out of my academic work. And also I got paid and got to do interesting things rather than feel I was in this quite abstruse place. So that's why I made the move, I think. I enjoyed it.
So how does that usually work? Because for lay people out there who are not part of the Star Trek universe, the original story, the original narrative was created by Gene Roddenberry.
Roddenberry is there for quite a long time. So anyone listening to this, I'm going to assume that you at least know who Kirk and Spock are. But so at least the 60s show, or perhaps the movies from the 1980s. I'm going to hazard a guess that people also might have an idea who Jean-Luc Picard is. They might have heard of him. And that's a show from the late 80s called Star Trek: The Next Generation. And Gene Roddenberry is behind creating Next Generation. So he's still there. And a lot of the earlier scripts for Next Generation are from a sort of project that he'd hoped to launch in the 70s. So there's quite a lot of continuity. At the same time, he's working with a TV exec called Rick Berman. And Rick Berman and another exec called Michael Piller are involved in the creation of Star Trek The Next Generation. And then when Roddenberry kind of retires, it's Berman and Piller who go on to create Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which is the next show, Voyager, which I suspect people might know, Catherine Janeway, and then the final one in that kind of round, which is Enterprise, which is not so well known. So there's a lot of continuity with Roddenberry. There's a sense perhaps that maybe Rick Berman is the keeper of the flame, that he's sort of the one who perhaps knows what Roddenberry wanted or what his intent was. It starts to move fairly quickly from that, and shows like Deep Space Nine, you don't see these sort of, you start to see much greyer storylines, much more black and white, politicized stories in a different way than perhaps the original Trek was. And then the show goes off air, Enterprise goes off air, I'm not quite sure of the date, maybe 2004 or something. And we have this long hiatus until just a few years ago, really, when Discovery came back. So you've got 3 eras of Star Trek. And in between this, there are a lot of things like novels, which is where my involvement. And now we have Discovery.
So
we've got Picard. We've got lots of stuff going on. So, yeah.
So your next career step would be if one of your books would be turned into a moving images series, right?
No, actually, no, not at all. No, I'm not a TV writer by any stretch of the imagination. No, I'm a novelist. So obviously, if somebody rang me up and said, Una, could you do as a script in the next few days? TV writing is a very specific mode. It's extremely technical.
But I mean, the line based on a novel by would be nice already, right?
Obviously it would. Yeah, it'd be absolutely fantastic. But as long as I don't have to write the screenplay. So TV's it's a very, there's lots of stakeholders. There's a production company. There's the studio. There's the writers. There's the designers. There's lots and lots of stuff going on. Whereas if you're writing a novel, you're basically left to yourself for 8 to 12 weeks just to get on with things. So I've worked quite closely with people in the writer's room. So I wrote a novel based on Star Trek Picard, which is a prequel novel to the show. And we worked very closely. I worked very closely with the writer's room, one of the co-creators, Kirsten Beyer, and because we wanted these two things to feel like they meshed. But TV writing's really hard work, really technical. But as you say, if they rang, I wouldn't turn them down.
Do you have a favorite character among the Star Trek heroes?
Star Trek heroes. So the ones that people would know, I'm who could not love Jean-Luc Picard? He's like the best man, isn't he? He's a Renaissance man, a kind of fully actualized human being. He's intelligent, he's wise, he's decisive, he's compassionate. He's really Roddenberry's ideal human. He manages not to be awfully sexist as well, which is something that perhaps 60s Trek is not so good at. And I have many highways and byways of lesser known characters. There's a character in Deep Space Nine called Garak, who is the sort of voice piece for realpolitik and a little dose of cynicism. And it's so not Star Trek. It's such it's like the Greek chorus offering a critique of the delusions of imperialism and the grand narrative of, American dream. That it's a very important corrective, I think, to what Trek does. And I like that character very much. I've written extensively about that character. So, yeah. I've also written a book about Janeway, Captain Janeway, and being a woman in space. There's plenty of fertile territory.
How does one play on such a huge stage? I mean, like, that stage has so much history. So if you write a book, you could easily kill off a main character. But of course you wouldn't do that. So how does one go about working off the shoulders of such giants? Right.
Okay. First of all, you absolutely wouldn't kill off a main character. The studio wouldn't have it. Yeah. You wouldn't have that leeway. This is going to be a slightly complicated answer because being the sociologist that I am, I'm going to have to give you the sort of institutional context.
Sure.
We have time. I don't have liberty to write whatever I want. Usually particularly these days, now that the show is back in production, I'm usually approached to write a specific book. So when Star Trek Picard was launching, They wanted a prequel novel. They wanted a novel that told the story that led up to the show. And they asked me to write it. So they had a very clear idea of what they wanted this novel to do. So it was not that I rung up and I went, let's start by killing Big. No, we can't do that because he's the lead of our show. No, we're not going to do that. So you're not going to do it at the end either because he's got to be alive for our show. So there were constraints setting out. But then within that, I had almost complete liberty. I just had to take this man from A to B and take him on that emotional trajectory. I've written other prequel novels for other characters out of Discovery, and you take them from A to B and then you explore the sidelines. When the show was off the air and I was writing novels throughout that period, I had a lot more freedom in terms of these kind of highways and byways that you could explore. You could go to planets that are a throwaway line in the show and effectively just come up with an entire civilization and cast of characters and history and whatever I wanted, purely for the needs of the novel that I was doing at the time. So the same happened with Doctor Who, which is another franchise that I've written in, is that while the show was off the air, the books were that set of characters and settings were living. And people got very playful. Not many people were reading those books, so you could do as much as you like. Once a programme comes back on air and is very high profile, which Star Trek, particularly Picard, has been, and Doctor Who has been as well, then I think the books perhaps are a little less experimental in terms of they're not as wacky, perhaps, or they won't take as many narrative risks, but they're doing something different. They're trying to illuminate and expand that world that you're seeing on screen and do that in a sort of interesting way. So it's a kind of swings and roundabouts. Either way, you get to be a bit more playful over here, but over here you get to sort of participate in a very current narrative and a narrative that people are interested in reading.
How do you get yourself into the mood, into the writing mood, to immerse yourself in that universe, in that vastness of space? Do you have any, I don't know, things you usually do, like your favorite cup of tea, or usually work at 3 a.m. in the night? Or do you have any such things?
Well, people think there's a kind of glamour to writing, but at the end of the day, it's your job. So I do exactly what everybody else does.
And it's hard work.
Well, it's not coal mining, but it's not good on the lower back. So I do what everyone else does, which is that I sit down at my laptop every morning. I open Twitter. I then fritter away.
Get distracted.
Yeah, then fritter away an hour.
Then suddenly it's noon.
Then it's noon. I'm homeschooling at the moment. I've got little girls, so I don't have the whole day. I go, that day's a bit of a write-off. Let's see what tomorrow brings. But I think like many of it, particularly when you're doing a kind of job, imaginative fields, science is one. There are other types of creative. They involve this thing that we call deep work. And at some point you need to just put everything aside and get very immersed in your project. So there are periods through the year of maybe 4 or 5 weeks at a time where my partner and my daughter will be saying things to me and I will be, you spoke to me, I think, about half an hour ago.
Unreachable.
Yeah. I'm really sorry I was in space. Yeah. Okay. And it's that, I think with all of these sort of creative things that people do that involve tapping into a deep of oneself and producing something imaginative, science does this. I'm sure scientists experience this as well. And something that requires deep concentration over an extended period of time, you find tricks at being able to move between the quotidian and your own rhythm of work across an extended creative period of time. So we all find those rhythms, those ways of tapping that deeper self that produces that better work. And novel writing is exactly the same, I think.
Do you binge sci-fi movies for an extended period of time prior to working on a new novel to get yourself into the mood?
The opposite, actually. I will binge what I'm working on in order to immerse myself, firstly in a setting, but also in what I guess TV writers would call tone, which is the flavour of a show, and also the voices of the characters that I'll be working with. So I watched a lot of Next Generation to hear Patrick Stewart's voice. When I wrote the Janeway book, obviously, I watched the whole of Voyager over a period of a few months. That was quite intense. But in a way you don't want... I usually find when I'm writing, I tend not to be reading or indeed consuming much TV or film because I don't want other people's narratives getting in the way of my own. It's a distraction. So I'm mostly just either immersed in my story, or I can't listen to music either. That disrupts the voices. So I go it's quite boring. Writers are very boring people. We do sit by ourselves for extended periods of time, very locked in our thoughts. I think the other thing maybe that writing, particularly novel writing, has in common with other creative practice, perhaps like scientific work, is the sense of unlocking a puzzle. It's as if I watch scientists speak and I watch novelists speak, and they often move their hands in front of themselves like they're manipulating a piece of play or a sort of 3D puzzle. And novels are like that.
Minority Report style.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. For people to imagine it. Yeah, it's like they're manipulating some sort of space in front of them. And certainly you're doing that with a novel as you're kind of interlocking plot strands and character and theme and symbol and imagery. You're trying to fix it all together.
Speaking of plot strands, if you're starting to write a new novel, do you usually know how it ends, or what is it that you already know before you start writing a novel?
I usually know pretty much everything of the broad narrative, partly because this is a requirement from the publishers. They ask for an outline. So if I'm being commissioned to write a 80,000 to 100,000 word novel, I'll be asked to produce an outline. And that might be somewhere between 7 to 10,000 words. Maybe a little less sometimes, but usually about 6 to 8,000 words, which is a substantial chunk. Yeah, that's
how many pages? Is that?
Oh crumbs! I don't know. It's down to point size, isn't it? I think so. So a 100,000 word novel is usually about 350 pages, I think, and then your outline sort of says, okay, here's your cast of characters. Here's broadly what the book will look like, the number of chapters. Here's what's going to happen broadly in each chapter. And usually I have a sense of what the climactic scene is, or what the key moment of the book is, the climax of it, the heart of it, the destination. But then you have to spend a lot of time with these books. The thing about novels is that they take time to put on the page. So you have to not be bored while you're doing it. So you need to leave yourself kind of little pockets of unknown. And that's where the pleasure of sitting down and writing it comes from. Is that, I see why this connects together, or I didn't realise why I'd put that there. I see why this character is there now. It's to illuminate this aspect of the story or whatever. So you have to. I like to know where I'm going, but I don't necessarily want to know what I'll see on the way, I think.
Sometimes, especially in academic circles, there's a lot of interpretation going on in literature classes when it comes to movies, famous movies, and what the writer might have hidden as a secret, as an Easter egg in that piece of literature, in that novel. But let's take, for example, one of the most known pieces of space science fiction. That is, of course, Space Odyssey, 2001 by Stanley Kubrick. A film that ends in a weird manner, especially when you think of that astronaut ending up in that bedroom, in that Baroque bedroom or Renaissance bedroom. So do you think that is something that happened out of, I don't know, an intoxicated meta state of a writer? Or was that done deliberately? What do you think?
I think we need to remember it was the 1960s. So probably helpful thinking about it. We probably need to distinguish between Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 and Stanley Kubrick's 2001. So I'm not necessarily convinced that they're the same thing.
Yes.
Clarke is, again, this idea of species evolution, this idea that we can transcend ourselves in some way. So that is there, I think. Kubrick is a visual writer, which I know. I mean, I'm no Kubrick. I'm not a visual narrator. I don't see images at all. But I think it's a very important film because it does turn science fiction into spectacle in the way that Star Wars does, and it tries to communicate that vastness. There's something a little chilly about that cosmos as well, isn't there? There's something quite cold. You're on the edge of something that isn't human. the edge of something that's not quite comprehensible. It's a little Lovecraft in its own way, to some extent. So I think he does communicate that emptiness and coldness and alienness through those images extremely well. That you're locked in the safety of the bedroom and the safety of the womb imagery is almost a kind of protection against the fears of what the outside might hold, the terrors of the cosmos in a way. There's a little touch of horror to it. So who knows what Kubrick intended? It doesn't matter what Kubrick intended. It's more what we take from that film.
Yes, absolutely.
And actually what I take from that film is I never remember those bits. I remember the computer winding down and the sinisterness of those sort of quite a lot in common with The Shining, actually, that sort of chase around an empty space. But actually I remember the moments, the bit I remember is the gravity curving around the woman who walks around the edge of the sort of artificial gravity. And it's the technology, actually, that sort of entrances me when I watched 2001.
I'm remembering the pencil floating in space.
Yeah.
When the main character travels to the space station, I was wondering, how did they do it back in the 60s? Like, that's perfect zero gravity simulated here.
I remember Tom Hanks telling a story about filming Apollo 13, and he said the way they were doing the artificial gravity, the way the shot was framed up was basically you had the three of them just moving up and down like on it was like a treadmill or something. They were just, and then he said somebody walked past while we were filming this, and they must have looked in and gone, "My God, that new Tom Hanks is going to be an absolute turkey." But it was, those things very simply get it done, I think. So I don't know how they did it. So I'm sure it's false perspective, or just because it can't have been visual effects. But sometimes three guys just bobbing up and down on a treadmill does the job,
Absolutely. A completely different topic, pretty similar to the first question I was asking, but a little more precise. Science fiction or science fact? What comes first?
Oh, goodness. Does one have to come first? Can they not, I'm of the kind of school that says any kind of text I'm interested in, pass it here, I'll read it. I'll find a way to understand it. What can I take from it? What can I learn? How can it expand my thinking in some way? Some types of text I'm more literate in. I can only speak and read English, which is a terrible gap. I would struggle to read abstruse equations. I'm slightly more literate, I think, than the average British person. I can find my way through some sorts of reasoning. I don't think they necessarily need to be one ahead of the other. I think we can learn from both.
Wonderful. The reason I was asking is that Google announced an X Prize a couple of years ago, and that X Prize focuses on some technology that was envisioned in the Enterprise series, the tricorder. So I don't know if the Google X Prize ever resulted in anything similar, but I find it fascinating that something that got envisioned decades ago is now materializing in reality. Do you know anything about that X Prize?
I don't actually. No, I completely forgotten about it. I think what I always find really interesting about these is that you have a company has millions or billions to offer to encourage or stimulate the human imagination. And it asks for a sort of gadget. And I go, couldn't you be a little bit more imaginative? Could you not imagine, these are things you're taking from Star Trek rather than the moneyless economy or the perfect equality, or the self-actualization of the way that each person has the kind of sufficient leisure time to be multiply skilled and these kinds of things. And I always think
we need a gadget for that.
Perhaps we don't need a gadget is the is the answer. I think we're very good at gadgets. Perhaps we need to think a little bit more poetically.
In any case, beaming is still around as a technological place of longing.
Yeah.
What do you think? Will that ever become a reality?
Oh, from my sources, I'm told that it isn't possible. It's just not a thing. But yeah, wouldn't it be? I was just very snarky about gadgets, but at the end of the day, this stuff is cool, And yes, wouldn't that be completely brilliant? How it would have the absolute nightmare of regulating that during a pandemic would be something else. But that's its own problem, I think. But yeah, obviously we want instantaneous transmission and replication, limitless replication. Of course, we want these things. My
Absolutely.
kid wants a unicorn.
You know what? I usually refrain from repeating myself, but I asked that question a couple of episodes in the past, but now it fits too nicely. So imagine, Una, that your phone rings right now and you see an unknown caller and you pick it up and it's a person from the Enterprise hovering over you in space, and they're asking you, we could beam you up right now. What would you say? Considering you being a mother and a happy wife to your husband.
Oh, a happy partner to my partner, very unmarried, because I live in the future where patriarchy doesn't exist. So would I be? I would love to think that I would say yes. I am extremely timid. But actually, probably what I would say is, which one of my siblings has put you up to this isn't funny, is the first thing I would say. The second thing I'd say is, I can't possibly do this. I'm homeschooling this afternoon. But in my fantasy self, I would obviously immediately say, yes, take me to the limitless expanse of space. I'd love to imagine that I would. I rather suspect that I wouldn't. It's safer in the imagination.
Thank you. Thank you for that. At some point, I came across a quote that somehow holds me in its spell. Everything that is conceivable is possible. Unfortunately, I cannot remember where that quote comes from. What do you think of it? Everything that is conceivable is possible. Does it make sense?
I suppose I guess that as a speaking as a sociologist, I think that maybe we could be a little bit braver in how we sort of conceive or make the world possible. I think we're quite conservative in the way we organise ourselves. When we come to things like technological or scientific advancement, I would have to refer you to an expert. It would be something like, do we hit fundamental limits of the universe in which we inhabit? I'm basically a materialist, so I'm kind of like, well, we're going to hit limits somewhere else in so many more exciting and creative and freeing and collaborative and mutually aiding ways. I think we've fallen back, or there's always the potential to fall back, and we have in many ways. And I think we should keep being courageous about this, and keep the light on, and keep trying to live in better ways for all of us.
From the perspective as a science fiction writer, what's your grasp on what's going on in space at the moment? The new space race, Elon Musk's endeavors, ESA, NASA.
Again, I think I juggle this sort of memory of that 6-year-old who is enamoured, and my fears of how we might squander or waste or exploit this new opportunity, and if we're exploring space simply to replicate mistakes that we've made on Earth, let's not do it that way, guys. Let's do it a bit better.
Let's visit Mars, but not conquer it.
Exactly. And let's think carefully about what we take out there with us. But yeah, of course, who doesn't want to go out there? Of course we all want to do. Of course we do. And at the back of my mind, I read Douglas Adams at a very early age, and I'm convinced that the universe is teeming with life, that and vast and glorious intergalactic civilizations that have merely not noticed us yet, or have kind of looked at us and gone, yeah, we'll just leave them to their own devices for a while. They're a bit useless.
To what extent does a science fiction writer need to know basics about astrophysics and physics in general?
Well, this one certainly got away with a great deal, if that's the case. I don't even pretend that I'm writing hard science fiction. I'm writing. I'm writing as a sociologist. I'm writing as someone who's interested in cultures, in societies, in the dynamics of history, in the dynamics of geopolitics. Who's using science fiction as imaginative space for that. I think science fiction as a genre is a broad church. It can sustain all these kinds of writing. In the past, perhaps we might have seen a situation where hard science fiction was really, the stuff that was kind of valued. I don't think that's the case now. I think people are a little bit more flexible in how they approach the genre, which is all to the good. And periodically we see literary writers, people who are more perhaps from the literary end, kind of dabble in science fiction and use some of its tools or its creative flexibility, and some very, very good and interesting stuff comes out. So I think it's not essential. I wish I was better informed, just because I like to be well informed and well read, and have a sense of a broad understanding of the world. But like the universe, I sometimes hit my limits of understanding.
Do you have any upcoming projects you're willing to talk about?
I'm working on a lot of things at the moment, but I don't think they've been announced yet. So I can't really announce them. I have 2 books out at the moment that I think people might enjoy if they're interested in Star Trek. I have my novel about Jean-Luc Picard, which is all about institutional collapse. And disappointment. Yeah, it's a really jolly book, actually. And then I have what we've called an autobiography of Catherine Janeway. So with the conceit is that I have interviewed her about her life and put these interviews down on the page. And that's a very different book. That's about the delight of Star Trek and the delight of possibility. And so those are the 2 sort of projects.
They're available in preferably your local bookstores.
Preferably, very much so. Yes, try not to Amazon them if you can.
Yes,
and then I hope we'll be announcing a couple of new things quite soon. But obviously, we've publishing, like everything else, has been slightly out of whack over the last year. So yeah.
How can people follow your progress, your work?
My website, which is unamccormack.co.uk, there's usually an update there every so often. I have a newsletter that I was sending out weekly. I've been a little quiet, I've been writing, so I've not sent it out for a few weeks. And of course, if they want to see me being bad-tempered during the course of the day, then they're very welcome to follow me on Twitter, which is at Una McCormack. So if people like seeing a middle-aged science fiction writer get cross, they're very welcome to come and take a look.
I'll put both in our show notes.
Lovely.
So we do have a fun tradition at the end of our show, and that is for me to ask my guests to share a quick piece of inspiration when it comes to anything, any kind of thought without much thinking that comes into your mind about science, about technology, about inspiration. So without much thinking, what would you like to share with our audience?
So what I always tell my writing students is that your project is always shit right up until the moment that it isn't.
Thank you.
So
wonderful.
So live with that. Don't give up. Push on. And eventually it will stop being awful and it will start being pretty good.
Wonderful.
And that's about as inspirational as I can manage, yes. I'm afraid.
Thank you so much, Una, for taking the time.
My
that was
pleasure.
a wonderful conversation.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me.
Push on. I like that. No matter what others say, do what you love, but don't do it half-heartedly. Thank you, Una, and thank you to all of you out there for listening. As always, it's a pleasure. And if you would like to learn a little more about the space world, please go to SpaceWatch.Global to adjust your daily dose of space news to your liking. And as always, we love to read from you. Share your ideas at podcast@spacecafe.global. Until then, we're looking forward to serving you our next episode as always, every other week. Thank you for listening today.